Welcome to Podcasting Smarter, the podcast for podcasters by podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello and welcome to Podcasting Smarter. This is Norma Jean Belenky, Podbean's head of events. And in today's episode, we're having a conversation with Podbean's Senior Vice President of Advertising, Kerry Tracy, on podcast advertising strategies for businesses. Stay tuned, and here we go. Hi, Kerry. How's it going?
Hi, Norma Jean. Good. How are you doing?
Good. We're so excited to chat with you here today because podcast advertising is fascinating and complicated, or it can feel that way at least. So for businesses out there, that want to make the most of their advertising and to have a strategy, let's talk about kind of what those are and how businesses can make the most of it. Obviously with Podbean, we've got our ads marketplace. Over 35,000 podcasts are listed there. So if you're a business or a podcaster, you can just jump on there and purchase ads on another podcast. It's really phenomenal. But, there is some nuance and there is some strategy. So we're here to talk about that today.
Great.
So the first question I kind of want to ask you is, podcast listeners have certain behavior, right? We always talk about like the behavior of listeners. And I think that's a common term in media, right? Where listener behavior, right? And so first off, I want to ask why it's important to understand the behavior of podcast listeners when you're looking at putting a advertising campaign together. And podcasting in particular, because when people listen to podcasts, they're multitasking, right?
Exactly. Podcasting is, you can look at it as a challenge, or you can look at it as the uniqueness, take advantage of the uniqueness. And uniqueness is that, as you mentioned, people are typically engaged in other activities, whether it be driving, walking, working. And as a result, it's difficult to prompt an immediate action like, going directly to a website or calling an 800 number. So it's really important to design the ad to have the ability to remember it. And it's also important too, which we'll get into a little later, the type of podcasts that you get into, whether, folks are active listeners. As an example, if you're listening to an episodic show or a true crime show, you really have to listen to it. Otherwise, you're going to have to back it up and listen to it again, versus a passive where you may be listening to an interview podcast where you can kind of space out a little. But yes, understanding that audience is important for the design and, the, production of the actual creative.
Yeah, absolutely. And, repetition plays a really big part in, people remembering your ad, right? If they hear it, what is it like? If they hear it once, they won't remember it. It takes like a certain number of impressions in general for people to remember an ad. So tell us about how repetition helps in transforming short-term memory to long-term memory, which is kind of, it's really interesting the way our brains hold on to things.
Yeah, repetition is important in any advertising campaign across any media channel. And back in the day, they would say, as you mentioned, first time is awareness. Second time, people, starts to trigger. And, it takes the third to kind of sixth time for them to take action. So repetition is really important for advertisers to make sure they get that, proper frequency in their campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are the benefits of increasing brand familiarity through repetition? Not just for, maybe the immediate buy the thing now, right? But in the long term of the brand as well.
Yeah, increasing the brand, making it familiar to your audience is important. So, you can recall the message later, whether you're telling a friend or you're going to the store or whatever the case may be, or even if you're, listening to podcasts when you're walking and you go back home and you want to go online and get it or do it on your phone when you finish walking. So being familiar with brand obviously is important, but reinforcing, key messages as it relates to the talking points of that brand, what that brand wants you to know is really important. And then thirdly, creating an association with that podcast is important. There are certain podcasts that you may have heard that one particular product over and over again. And that's, not a mistake or just happenstance. They do it for a reason. They do it because they either like that host and they like the way that host presents himself and the narrative of that show, and they want to be associated with that particular podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that halo effect of, my product or my brand is associated with this podcast and people are going to associate, the brand with the podcast as a result. So absolutely.
Exactly. And it's that trust and credibility of that, particular host.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I guess next I want to ask you, in terms of creating an association with the podcast, what's the impact of that we've had brands see? Because, obviously as listeners, from the advertising side, as podcasters, we know that it's out there, but from the brand side, what's that relationship like in terms of between the brand and the listener, or who hopefully becomes the consumer?
Well, at the end of the day, the impact should be your ROI or your return on investment, and ultimately conversions or sales. That's the ultimate impact or brand awareness that, a certain brand wants to be associated with a certain audience. So, you look at Apple and, Steve Jobs was a genius when it came to, talking more about the quality of the brand, versus, buy this product now. You've never seen that with Apple. It's always been, that approach that they have towards their brand. And really that helped them increase their brand awareness and ultimately sell more product. And that's really the end game.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it also sounds like, going back to that repetition, it does drive customer conversions, right? The more you hear an ad, the more likely it's going to stick in your head. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Kerry, this is a short episode today based on one of our blog posts here at Podbean, which you can read here in the show notes. We've got the link, and we've got just so much content on the Podbean blog. The link's here in the show notes. It's blog.podbean.com. But before we end today, I'd like to ask one more question. Can you share a successful example or case study of where repetition in podcast advertising has led to significant business results for an advertiser?
Yeah, I think the best example would be, the number one podcast advertiser who spent over $500 million in just podcasting last year, which is BetterHelp. I mean, clearly they believe in repetition and they're increasing their budget. They've increased it significantly year over year for the last couple of years, and it doesn't look like they're slowing down. So it works without a doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kerry Tracy, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Podcasting Smarter. If you have any podcasting questions or want to get in touch, send us an email at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thanks so much and happy podcasting.